My husband was in my kitchen teaching another woman how to make my dead grandmother's tres leches cake, the same recipe I'd protected like a sacred trust for 20 years. The same recipe that had been passed down through 4 generations of women in my family. And he was giving it away to his affair partner like it was something he'd learned from a cookbook. My name is Sarah, and this is the story of how I discovered my marriage was a carefully constructed lie, and how I used the very thing he tried to steal from me to destroy the future he thought he was building behind my back. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. I never thought I'd be the woman with this kind of story to tell. Growing up in San Antonio, I was the responsible daughter, the one who learned to cook at my grandmother's side while my older sister Jessica was out causing drama and breaking hearts. I was the girl who memorized every ingredient, every technique, every family story that came with our recipes. When Abuela Rosa passed away when I was 14, she left me something more valuable than money or jewelry. She left me her legacy, written on stained index cards in her careful cursive, recipes that had fed our family through poverty, celebration, heartbreak, and joy. Those recipes weren't just instructions for making food. They were pieces of our history. The mole sauce that took 2 full days to prepare properly, with its 23 ingredients that had to be added in a specific order while stirring clockwise, was the same one her mother had made to celebrate her father's return from working the railroads. The tamales that sold out every Christmas at St. Michael's fundraiser were the exact ones her grandmother had made to feed striking workers during the Depression. The tres leches cake that made grown men weep was the recipe that had won her new husband's family over when she was just 17 and terrified of not being good enough. I carried these stories with me when I moved to Austin for nursing school. I carried them through the long nights studying for my RN exam, making Abuela's café de olla to keep me awake, tasting her strength in every sip. I carried them into my first apartment, my first job at Austin General Hospital, my first real relationship. When I met Mike Patterson at a friend's barbecue, I was 22 and he was 24, this ambitious guy with dreams of opening his own restaurant and enough charm to make me believe I could be part of that dream. Mike wasn't like the other guys I dated. He didn't just compliment my cooking and move on. He asked questions. He wanted to know where I'd learned to balance flavors like that, how I knew exactly when the oil was hot enough for churros, why my coffee tasted different from everyone else's. He listened to my stories about Abuela Rosa with the kind of attention that made me feel like those memories mattered to someone besides me. When I finally trusted him enough to make him her mole sauce after we'd been dating for 8 months, he actually cried. He said it was the most incredible thing he'd ever tasted, that he could taste the love that had gone into perfecting it over generations. That was the moment I fell completely. Not just for Mike, but for the idea that I'd found someone who understood what those recipes meant to me. Someone who would protect them the way I had been taught to protect them. When he asked me to marry him 2 years later, proposing with a simple ring and a promise that we'd build something beautiful together, I said yes, without hesitation. I said yes because I believed he saw the same value in tradition and family that I did. I said yes because when he looked at me making Abuela's flan, I saw respect in his eyes, not just hunger. The first few years of our marriage felt like everything I'd dreamed of. Mike worked as a line cook at various restaurants around Austin, learning different techniques, building his resume. I worked 12-hour shifts at the hospital, coming home exhausted but still finding energy to cook the meals that kept us connected to something bigger than ourselves. He'd watch me work in the kitchen with the intensity of someone studying for an exam, asking me to repeat certain steps, wanting to understand the reasoning behind every choice Abuela had made. I thought his interest was love. I thought he was trying to honor my family's legacy by learning it properly. When he started culinary school 3 years into our marriage, using my recipes as inspiration for his assignments, I was proud. His instructors raved about the authenticity of his dishes, the complexity of flavors that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than textbook knowledge. He'd come home with stories about how his tres leches cake had impressed the pastry chef, how his professor had asked for the mole recipe for a special dinner. I felt like I was contributing to his success, like Abuela's legacy was helping him achieve his dreams. I supported him through every step of his culinary education, working overtime to cover our expenses while he studied. I bought him the good knives he needed, the specialized equipment, the expensive ingredients for practice runs. When he graduated and started talking seriously about opening his own place, I was ready to make whatever sacrifices were necessary. This was our dream now, built on the foundation of my family's recipes and his technical skill. We were going to honor the past while creating something new. The changes started small. Mike began staying late after his shifts, claiming he needed to practice new techniques or study for wine certifications. He'd come home smelling like different spices, his clothes carrying scents I didn't recognize. When I asked about his day, his answers became vague, distracted. He started photographing everything I cooked, saying he wanted to document the recipes properly, maybe even create a cookbook someday. I thought it was sweet, this desire to preserve what Abuela had created. He became more interested in the technical aspects of my cooking, asking questions that felt different from before. Instead of wanting to know the stories behind the dishes, he wanted exact measurements, precise timing, specific temperatures. When I explained that Abuela had never written down measurements, that everything was done by feel and experience, he seemed frustrated. He'd watch me cook with his phone out, recording everything, taking notes like he was conducting research. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. I told myself his behavior was just stress from work, from the pressure of planning for his own restaurant. The service industry was demanding, and I knew how hard he was working to prove himself. When he started spending weekends at the library, researching business plans and restaurant management, I admired his dedication. When he began working late shifts at a new upscale place downtown, I understood he was learning from the best. I trusted him completely because I'd never had a reason not to. The first real red flag came during a family dinner at my cousin Maria's house. Mike was describing a new dish he'd created, talking about how he'd modified a traditional family recipe to make it more modern. My Aunt Elena, who had known Abuela Rosa since they were children, listened with a strange expression on her face. After dinner, she pulled me aside and asked quietly if Mike was planning to use our family recipes in his restaurant. The question surprised me. I told her of course he would use some of them, that it was a way of honoring Abuela's memory. She looked troubled. She reminded me that these recipes had never been shared outside our family, that there was a responsibility that came with knowing them. She said Abuela had always been careful about who she taught, that she'd turned down requests from neighbors and friends who wanted to know her secrets. I brushed off her concerns, telling her that Mike was family now, that Abuela would have wanted her recipes to live on and reach more people. But something about that conversation stuck with me, a small seed of doubt that I tried to ignore. The doubt grew when I noticed Mike's laptop open one evening, displaying what looked like a business plan. I glimpsed sections about menu development and signature dishes, but when he saw me looking, he quickly closed it, saying it was just homework from a business class he was taking. I didn't push, but I started paying more attention to things I'd previously overlooked. The way he'd changed our grocery shopping routine, insisting on buying ingredients I didn't recognize. The new cookbooks that appeared in our kitchen, focusing on modern interpretations of traditional Mexican cuisine. The phone calls he'd take in another room, speaking in hushed tones about permits and locations. One evening in September, I came home from a particularly brutal shift at the hospital to find Mike in the kitchen with another nurse from work, showing her how to make Abuela's café de olla. He introduced her as Jennifer, someone new to the unit who was interested in learning about different coffee traditions. I felt a stab of something I couldn't quite name. These recipes weren't party tricks or casual lessons. They were intimate, personal, sacred. But I smiled and said hello, telling myself I was being overly protective. After Jennifer left, I asked Mike why he'd chosen to share that particular recipe. He said he thought it would help her feel welcome at work, that food was a universal language. His answer felt rehearsed, like he'd prepared it in advance. I wanted to explain why that bothered me, but I couldn't find the words that wouldn't make me sound possessive or selfish. These were just recipes after all. Just food. Except they weren't, and he should have understood that by now. The breaking point came on a Thursday evening in October. I'd planned to surprise Mike with dinner, after finishing my shift early, something I rarely got to do anymore with our mismatched schedules. I stopped at the Mexican market to pick up fresh masa for tortillas, thinking I'd make his favorite meal, the one Abuela used to prepare for special occasions. I wanted to recreate one of those early evenings when cooking for him felt like an act of love, not a routine obligation. I climbed the stairs to our second-floor apartment with grocery bags and expectations of a quiet evening together. But as I reached our door, I heard voices coming from inside. Mike's voice, familiar and animated, and another voice I didn't recognize. A woman's voice, laughing at something he'd said. I fumbled with my keys, assuming he'd invited a coworker over, maybe someone from the restaurant who needed advice or help with something. But when I opened the door and heard what they were actually discussing, my world shifted off its axis. They were in my kitchen, and Mike was explaining the exact technique for tempering chocolate for Abuela's flan. Not just explaining it, but demonstrating it, walking this woman through every step that had taken me years to master. She was taking notes, asking questions about timing and temperature, treating my grandmother's secret like a recipe she'd found online. I stood frozen in the entryway, grocery bags cutting into my hands, listening to Mike share knowledge that wasn't his to give. He was telling her about the importance of the water bath, about how Abuela had taught me to know when the custard was ready by the way it moved when you tilted the pan. He was sharing the story about how this flan had been the dessert at every birthday party, every celebration, every moment when our family needed something sweet to balance the bitter parts of life. The woman, whoever she was, seemed genuinely fascinated. She asked about the history of the recipe, about whether it had always been made the same way. Mike answered with authority, as if he'd been there for those conversations with Abuela, as if he'd earned the right to speak for my family's traditions. He told her that my grandmother had been a genius with flavors, that she'd never written down measurements, but had taught me everything through muscle memory and intuition. Then she said something that made my stomach drop. She asked if these were the recipes they'd be using for the restaurant, and whether I knew about their plans. Mike laughed, a sound I'd heard 1,000 times before, but that now seemed foreign and cruel. He said I had no idea what they were building together, that I was too focused on my hospital work to pay attention to his real ambitions. He said the recipes would be the foundation of their success, that no one would know where they really came from once the restaurant opened. Their restaurant, their success, their future built on my family's legacy, constructed in secret while I worked double shifts to support what I thought were our shared dreams. I set the grocery bags down silently and backed out of the apartment, my hands shaking as I pulled the door closed behind me. I sat in my car in the parking lot for 20 minutes, trying to process what I'd just discovered, trying to understand how the man I'd trusted with my most precious inheritance had been planning to steal it from me. This wasn't just infidelity. This wasn't just a husband having an affair. This was theft of the deepest, most personal kind. Mike wasn't just betraying our marriage. He was betraying my grandmother's memory, my family's history, everything I'd been taught to protect and preserve. He was taking the recipes that had sustained us through generations of struggle and turning them into commodities for his own profit and pleasure. I drove around Austin for hours that night, past the restaurants where Mike had worked, past the hospital where I'd spent so many nights thinking about our future together. I thought about Abuela Rosa, about how she'd chosen me to carry on her legacy, about the trust she'd placed in a 14-year-old girl who promised to keep the family traditions alive. I thought about the years I'd spent perfecting her techniques, learning not just the recipes but the reasons behind them, the love and history that made them more than just instructions for combining ingredients. By the time I returned home, Mike was asleep, or pretending to be. I lay next to him in the dark, this man who'd shared my bed for 8 years, and realized I didn't know him at all. The Mike I'd fallen in love with, the one who'd cried over my mole sauce and promised to honor my family's traditions, had either never existed or had been replaced by someone willing to steal from the woman who'd supported his every dream. But as I stared at the ceiling that night, something else began to form alongside my heartbreak and rage. A plan. If Mike thought he could build his future on the foundation of my family's recipes, he was about to learn exactly how much those recipes were really worth. And he was about to discover that the quiet, trusting wife he'd been lying to was capable of protecting her inheritance in ways he never imagined. The woman who fell asleep that night was different from the one who'd come home with grocery bags and dinner plans. She was someone who understood that some betrayals require more than tears or confrontation. They require justice. And justice, I was about to learn, could be served as precisely as any of Abuela Rosa's carefully perfected recipes. I had always been the steady one in every relationship, every friendship, every family gathering. While my sister Jessica thrived on chaos and drama, creating scenes that somehow always ended with her getting exactly what she wanted, I was the one people called when they needed reliability. I was the daughter who showed up to family dinners with perfectly prepared dishes. I was the friend who remembered birthdays and anniversary dates. I was the wife who worked overtime without complaint to support her husband's dreams of culinary greatness. Mike Patterson had been different from every other man I'd dated, or at least I thought he was. Where other boyfriends had seen my cooking as a nice bonus, something convenient and impressive to show off to their friends, Mike seemed to genuinely appreciate the artistry and tradition behind what I created. He didn't just eat my food, he studied it. He asked thoughtful questions about techniques and ingredients. He listened to my stories about Abuela Rosa with the kind of focused attention that made me feel like I was sharing something truly valuable. In those early years, Mike's ambition felt like something we were building together. He'd come home from his line cook jobs at various Austin restaurants, exhausted but energized, full of stories about what he'd learned that day. He'd describe new techniques he'd observed, flavor combinations that had surprised him, management styles that he wanted to emulate or avoid when he eventually opened his own place. I loved listening to these stories, loved feeling like I was part of his professional growth, even though my own career was taking me in a completely different direction. The contrast between us had seemed complementary rather than problematic. Mike was the dreamer, always talking about the restaurant he'd own someday, sketching floor plans on napkins, describing the ambiance he wanted to create. I was the pragmatist, the one who researched small business loans and calculated how much we'd need to save for startup costs. He was creative and spontaneous. I was organized and thorough. He took risks. I provided stability. It felt like a partnership where our different strengths balanced each other perfectly. Mike's charm was undeniable, and he knew how to use it. He could talk his way into opportunities that other people struggled to find. He'd convinced the head chef at Meridian, one of Austin's most prestigious restaurants, to let him stage there, for free just by showing up with a perfectly executed version of my abuela's mole sauce. He'd talked our landlord into reducing our rent by offering to cook a private dinner party for his family. He had this way of making people feel special, like they were the only person in the room who mattered. I thought that charm was reserved for professional situations, that at home with me, he was just genuinely interested in my family's culinary heritage. When he'd watch me cook with that intense focus, taking mental notes about every step of the process, I interpreted it as love and respect for my traditions. When he'd ask me to repeat certain techniques or explain the reasoning behind particular ingredient combinations, I saw it as his way of honoring Abuela Rosa's memory by learning from her granddaughter. The difference in our backgrounds should have been more obvious to me. Mike came from a family where food was fuel, nothing more. His mother opened cans and heated frozen dinners. His father considered a successful meal one that was ready in under 20 minutes. They ate to survive, not to celebrate or connect or remember. When I first cooked for his parents, they'd been polite but clearly confused by the time and effort I'd put into preparing what they saw as unnecessarily complicated food. Mike, on the other hand, had been raised on this kind of utilitarian approach to eating, which made his fascination with my cooking seem even more meaningful. I thought I was opening his eyes to something beautiful, teaching him that food could be art and history and love all combined into one experience. I thought I was giving him something his family had never provided, a deeper understanding of how meals could nourish more than just the body. My family had welcomed Mike with the kind of enthusiasm they reserved for people who genuinely appreciated our traditions. My mother, usually reserved with my boyfriends, had been charmed by his questions about her own cooking techniques. My aunts had competed to share their favorite stories about Abuela Rosa, each trying to impress him with their memories of her legendary skill in the kitchen. Even my cousin Maria, who was notoriously difficult to please, had approved of Mike's respectful attitude toward our family recipes. That approval had meant everything to me. Growing up as the quiet, responsible daughter in a family that often celebrated Jessica's more dramatic personality, I'd rarely felt like I was the one bringing something special to the table. But with Mike, I was the expert. I was the one with knowledge worth learning. I was the keeper of traditions that could actually contribute to someone else's success and happiness. For the first time in my life, being steady and reliable felt like superpowers rather than consolation prizes. Our early married life had reinforced this dynamic. Mike would come home from work eager to hear about my day at the hospital, but even more eager to see what I was planning to cook for dinner. He'd change out of his chef's whites and immediately start asking what he could do to help, whether there were techniques he could practice or preparations he could handle. I'd teach him how to properly clean chilies for mole, how to achieve the right consistency for mesa, how to tell when oil was at the perfect temperature for churros. These kitchen lessons had felt like the most intimate part of our relationship. More than our conversations about work or future plans, more than our quiet evenings watching movies or reading together, these moments when I was passing down Abuela's knowledge felt like the true foundation of our marriage. I was sharing something I'd never shared with anyone else, something that connected Mike not just to me, but to generations of women who had come before me. Mike's questions during these lessons had seemed so genuine, so respectful. He'd ask about the history behind certain techniques, wanting to understand why Abuela had chosen to do things in specific ways. He'd inquire about regional variations, about how our family's recipes differed from other versions he'd encountered in restaurants or cookbooks. He'd request the stories that went with each dish, the memories of when Abuela had made them, the occasions that had called for particular recipes. I'd shared all of it willingly, proudly. I'd told him about how Abuela's tamales had fed striking workers during the Depression, how her wedding cookies had been served at my parents' engagement party, how her café de olla had kept me awake during nursing school finals. I'd explained the spiritual aspects of her cooking, how she'd believed that the energy and intention you brought to food preparation could actually be tasted in the final dish. I'd taught him her little rituals, like always stirring clockwise, and never cooking when you were angry or upset. Mike had absorbed all of this information with what appeared to be reverence. He'd nod seriously when I explained the importance of using the right type of chocolate for mole, or why certain spices had to be toasted in a particular order. He'd practice techniques until he could execute them smoothly, though he never quite achieved the intuitive understanding that came from growing up with these recipes. I'd thought his dedication was beautiful. This man who was willing to learn not just the mechanics of cooking, but the cultural and emotional significance behind every dish. The shift in our relationship had been so gradual that I'd barely noticed it happening. Mike's questions had become more technical and less emotional. Instead of asking about the memories associated with recipes, he'd focus on exact measurements and timing. Instead of wanting to understand the stories behind dishes, he'd want to know how they could be modified or modernized. Instead of appreciating the traditional techniques, he'd suggest improvements or shortcuts that could make preparation more efficient. I'd rationalized these changes as natural evolution. Of course, he'd become more focused on technical aspects as his culinary skills improved. Of course, he'd think about how recipes could be adapted for restaurant service rather than home cooking. Of course, he'd be interested in innovation rather than just preservation. I'd told myself that this was what growth looked like, that Mike was building on the foundation I'd given him to create something new and exciting. But looking back now, I could see that something essential had been lost in that transition. The Mike who had cried over my mole sauce because he could taste the love and history in every spoonful had been replaced by someone who saw those same recipes as raw material for his own ambitions. The man who had once listened to stories about Abuela Rosa with genuine emotion had become someone who viewed those stories as marketing material for a restaurant concept. The respect I'd thought he had for my family's traditions had never been respect at all. It had been hunger, not the kind of hunger that comes from genuine appreciation and love, but the kind that comes from recognizing something valuable and wanting to possess it. Mike hadn't fallen in love with me and my heritage. He'd identified an opportunity and positioned himself to take advantage of it. All those nights, I'd worked overtime to support his culinary education. All those weekends I'd spent alone while he attended wine tastings and networking events. All those times I'd encouraged him to pursue his dreams, even when it meant sacrificing time together. I'd been funding and facilitating my own betrayal. I'd been so proud of his success, so excited about our shared future, that I'd never questioned whether that future actually included me in any meaningful way. The woman who had trusted so completely, who had shared her most precious inheritance, without a second thought, felt like a stranger to me now. How had I been so naive? How had I missed the signs that must have been there all along? How had I convinced myself that Mike's interest in my recipes came from love rather than greed? But even as I questioned my own judgment, I knew that the blame didn't lie with my trusting nature. The blame lay with a man who had seen something beautiful and sacred and decided it was his for the taking. The blame lay with someone who had accepted my trust and love and family traditions as his due, who had taken everything I'd offered and still wanted more. The blame lay with Mike Patterson, who was about to learn that the quiet, supportive wife he'd been betraying was capable of protecting what belonged to her in ways he had never imagined. The Friday after I discovered Mike in the kitchen with that woman, I moved through my hospital shift like someone sleepwalking. I checked on patients, administered medications, documented symptoms, and responded to doctors' orders, but my mind was stuck in that moment when I'd heard him explaining Abuela's chocolate tempering technique to a stranger. Every time I tried to focus on work, I'd hear his voice describing the importance of the water bath for flan, sharing knowledge that wasn't his to give. My colleague Jennifer noticed my distraction during our lunch break. She asked if I was feeling all right, whether I needed to go home early. I almost laughed at the irony. Jennifer, the same woman Mike had taught to make café de olla just weeks earlier, was showing me concern while having no idea that she'd been part of my growing realization that something was fundamentally wrong in my marriage. I told her I was fine, just tired from covering extra shifts, and she accepted the explanation with a sympathetic nod. But I wasn't fine. I was operating in a strange state of suspended animation, going through the motions of my normal life while everything I'd believed about my marriage crumbled in my mind. I kept replaying conversations with Mike from the past few months, looking for clues I'd missed, signs I should have recognized. The late nights he'd attributed to inventory and prep work, the weekend trips he'd claimed were for wine education and networking, the sudden interest in photographing my cooking that I'd interpreted as sweet documentation of family traditions. When I got home that evening, Mike was already there, sitting at our kitchen table with his laptop open and papers spread around him. He looked up when I walked in, giving me the same warm smile that had once made my heart skip, but now made my stomach turn. He asked about my day, whether the hospital had been busy, if I'd had time to eat lunch. The normalcy of his concern felt like mockery now that I knew what he was really doing with his time. I answered his questions mechanically while studying, his face for signs of guilt or deception. But Mike had always been good at compartmentalizing, at keeping different parts of his life separate and organized. The man sitting at our table, asking about my day and suggesting we order takeout for dinner, showed no trace of the man who'd been sharing my family's secrets with another woman just 24 hours earlier. He mentioned that he'd had a productive day, that he'd made some good connections for his restaurant project. The casual way he referred to his restaurant project, as if it were something I already knew about and supported, made my hands shake as I poured myself a glass of water. I wanted to ask him about these connections, about what kind of restaurant he was planning, about whether he'd mentioned me to any of his potential partners. But I couldn't trust myself to ask those questions without revealing what I'd discovered. Instead, I excused myself to take a shower, claiming I needed to wash off the hospital smell before I could relax. In the bathroom, I stood under the hot water and tried to figure out what to do next. I could confront Mike directly, demand explanations and apologies and promises that he'd never share my recipes with anyone else. I could threaten to leave him if he didn't abandon whatever plans he'd made with this other woman. I could try to salvage our marriage by establishing new boundaries around my family's traditions. But something deeper than anger was taking root in my chest, something cold and calculating that surprised me with its intensity. The more I thought about Mike's betrayal, the more I realized that this wasn't just about stolen recipes or even infidelity. This was about fundamental disrespect for everything I was and everything I'd brought to our relationship. This was about a man who'd seen my trust and love as weaknesses to be exploited rather than gifts to be treasured. The woman who'd fallen, asleep next to Mike for 8 years, who'd supported his dreams and shared her most precious inheritance with him, that woman would have chosen confrontation and compromise. She would have tried to fix what was broken, to rebuild trust through communication and counseling and renewed commitment. But the woman standing in that shower, finally seeing her marriage clearly for what it had become, she wanted something else entirely. She wanted justice. Over the weekend, I watched Mike more carefully than I ever had before. I noticed how he'd check his phone constantly, always angling the screen away from me when messages came in. I saw how he'd claim to be researching cooking techniques online, but would quickly switch browser tabs when I walked past his laptop. I observed the way he'd ask me seemingly innocent questions about recipe modifications, about how certain dishes might taste with different ingredient substitutions or presentation styles. On Saturday evening, he suggested we cook together, something we hadn't done in months. He wanted to make abuela's pozole, claiming he'd been craving it and thought it would be fun to prepare it as a team. I agreed, curious to see what he was really after. As we worked side by side in the kitchen, I noticed how he'd pause to take photos at crucial steps, how he'd ask me to repeat certain techniques while his phone was recording, how he'd request detailed explanations of timing and seasoning that went far beyond what he'd need to simply help with dinner. The Mike I'd fallen in love with had asked questions because he wanted to understand and appreciate my family's traditions. This Mike was asking questions because he wanted to document and replicate them. The difference was subtle but unmistakable once I knew to look for it. He wasn't trying to connect with my heritage. He was trying to extract value from it. Sunday morning brought a phone call that changed everything. Mike's phone rang while he was in the shower, and without thinking, I glanced at the screen to see who was calling. The name displayed was Amanda Chen, and something about seeing an unfamiliar woman's name on my husband's phone at 9 a.m. made my pulse quicken. The call went to voicemail, but a few minutes later, a text message appeared on his lock screen that I could read from across the room. Can't wait to finalize the menu today. The investors are going to love the authentic family recipes angle. I stared at those words until they were burned into my memory. Authentic family recipes angle. My grandmother's legacy, reduced to a marketing strategy. My inheritance, rebranded as someone else's business plan. The recipes that had sustained my family through generations of struggle, repackaged as a selling point for investors who would never know where they really came from. When Mike emerged from the bathroom, I was sitting on our bed with his phone in my hands. He stopped short when he saw me, water still dripping from his hair, his expression shifting from surprise to something that might have been panic. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then he asked in a voice that was trying too hard to sound casual, why I had his phone. I showed him the text message, watching his face carefully as he read Amanda's words. I expected him to deny everything, to claim it was a misunderstanding or that I was jumping to conclusions. Instead, he sat down heavily on the edge of the bed and put his head in his hands. The silence stretched between us like a chasm, filled with 8 years of marriage and trust and shared dreams that were crumbling in real time. Finally, Mike looked up at me with eyes that seemed to be calculating how much truth he could afford to tell. He said that Amanda was his business partner, that they'd been working together on a restaurant concept for the past 6 months. He admitted that some of my family's recipes were part of their menu planning, but he insisted that he'd always intended to tell me about it once their plans were more concrete. He claimed that he'd wanted to surprise me with the success they were building together, that he'd thought I'd be proud to see Abuela's recipes reaching a wider audience. Every word he spoke felt like another betrayal. The idea that he'd been planning to surprise me with the theft of my inheritance, that he'd thought I'd be grateful to see my family's traditions commercialized without my knowledge or consent, revealed a level of arrogance and entitlement that took my breath away. He was rewriting history in real time, trying to transform his deception into a romantic gesture that had simply been misunderstood. I asked him about Amanda, about how they'd met, and how long they'd been working together. Mike's answers were careful and rehearsed, focusing on professional collaboration and shared business goals. But I could hear the gaps in his story, the places where emotion leaked through his attempts at clinical explanation. When he described Amanda's passion for authentic cuisine and her business acumen, his voice carried a warmth that he hadn't used when talking about me in months. The conversation that followed was surreal in its politeness. We discussed their restaurant plans like we were talking about someone else's life. Mike explained their concept, their target market, their timeline for opening. He showed me mock-ups of their proposed menu, pointing out which dishes were inspired by my recipes and which came from other sources. He talked about the investors they'd been courting, the location they'd found, the staff they hoped to hire. Through it all, I maintained a calm that surprised both of us. I asked practical questions about financing and permits, about their projected costs and revenue streams. I listened to his explanations with the same focused attention I'd give to a patient's medical history. I didn't cry or shout or demand that he abandon his plans. I just gathered information, filing away every detail for future reference. What Mike didn't understand, what he couldn't have understood because he'd never really known me at all, was that my calmness wasn't acceptance or forgiveness. It was something much more dangerous. It was the stillness that comes before a storm, the quiet moment when all the pieces fall into place and you finally see exactly what needs to be done. That afternoon, while Mike went to meet with Amanda, about their investor presentation, I sat alone in our apartment and felt the last of my illusions about our marriage dissolve. The man I'd loved and trusted and supported for 8 years had never seen me as a partner. He'd seen me as a resource to be mined, a source of valuable assets that could be extracted and repurposed for his own benefit. My recipes, my stories, my family's legacy, they had never been sacred to him. They had been commodities waiting to be harvested. But Mike had made one crucial miscalculation. He'd assumed that because I was quiet and supportive and trusting, I was also passive and powerless. He'd confused my loyalty with weakness, my generosity with naivety. He'd thought that because I'd shared my inheritance freely, I had no ability to protect it when threatened. He was about to learn how wrong he was. That evening, as I sat in our apartment processing the truth about Mike's betrayal, I found myself thinking about all the times throughout my life when I'd been overlooked, underestimated, or taken for granted. The pattern was so clear now that I wondered how I'd missed it for so long. From childhood through my marriage, I'd been the reliable one, the steady presence that others could count on to always be there, always be supportive, always say yes to whatever was asked of me. Growing up in San Antonio, my role in the family had been established early and reinforced constantly. Jessica, 2 years older and infinitely more dramatic, commanded attention through sheer force of personality. She was the daughter who threw tantrums when she didn't get her way, who could charm her way out of trouble with tears and promises she never intended to keep, who somehow managed to make even her failures seem romantic and interesting. I was the daughter who cleaned up the messes Jessica left behind, who never complained when her crises took precedence over my achievements, who learned to find satisfaction in being needed rather than celebrated. The inequality hadn't been malicious. Exactly. My parents weren't deliberately favoring Jessica or actively trying to diminish me. They were just responding to the squeaky wheel, giving their attention to whichever daughter demanded it most loudly. Jessica's needs were urgent and dramatic, requiring immediate intervention and constant management. My needs were quiet and manageable, easily postponed or overlooked in the chaos of dealing with whatever crisis Jessica had created that week. I remembered the day I'd won the regional spelling bee in 8th grade, how proud I'd been walking home with my trophy, practicing the speech I'd give at dinner about the competition and the words that had stumped other contestants. But when I'd arrived home, Jessica was in the middle of a meltdown about some boy who'd broken up with her, sobbing dramatically in the living room, while my parents offered comfort and reassurance. My trophy had been acknowledged with a brief, "That's nice, honey," before the conversation returned to Jessica's broken heart and wounded pride. High school had brought more of the same pattern. I'd made varsity swim team as a freshman, an achievement that should have warranted celebration and recognition. I'd trained for months to earn that spot, waking up at 5 a.m. for practice, sacrificing social activities to maintain the schedule and discipline required for competitive swimming. But the week I'd made the team, Jessica had landed the lead role in the spring musical, and suddenly our house was filled with talk of costume fittings and rehearsal schedules, and how talented Jessica was to beat out seniors for such an important part. I'd learned to find my own forms of validation, to take pride in achievements that no one else seemed to notice or appreciate. My grades were consistently excellent, but since I never struggled academically, good report cards became expected, rather than celebrated. I'd volunteered at the local hospital throughout high school, discovering my calling in healthcare and building relationships with patients who appreciated my calm, competent presence. But nursing wasn't as glamorous or exciting as Jessica's. Acting ambitions, so my career plans received polite acknowledgement rather than enthusiastic support. The pattern had continued into college and beyond. I'd worked multiple jobs to pay for nursing school, maintaining a perfect GPA while Jessica's art degree was fully funded by our parents, who saw her creative pursuits as more important than my practical career choice. When I'd graduated with honors and landed my first position at Austin General, the family celebration had been modest and brief. When Jessica had gotten a small part in a local theater production, she'd been treated like she'd won an Oscar. Even my relationship with Mike had followed this familiar dynamic initially. I'd been the supportive girlfriend who worked extra shifts to help pay for his culinary education, who never complained when his schedule conflicted with ours, who celebrated his achievements and encouraged his dreams while quietly pursuing my own career goals. The difference was that Mike had seemed to appreciate my support in ways my family never had. He'd thanked me for my sacrifices, acknowledged the ways I'd helped him succeed, made me feel like an essential partner in his journey rather than an invisible footnote. That appreciation had been intoxicating after a lifetime of being taken for granted. When Mike had told me that he couldn't have achieved his culinary success without my support, when he'd credited my family's recipes with inspiring his passion for authentic flavors, when he'd talked about our future restaurant as something we'd build together, I'd felt valued and seen in ways I'd never experienced before. I'd thought I'd finally found someone who recognized my worth, who wouldn't overlook my contributions or assume my compliance. But now I could see that Mike's appreciation had been strategic rather than genuine. He'd recognized that I was someone who would give everything and ask for little in return. Someone whose loyalty could be counted on and whose boundaries could be gradually eroded. He'd seen my trusting nature and my desire to be valued, and he'd calculated exactly how to exploit those traits for his own benefit. The realization was devastating, not just because of what it revealed about Mike, but because of what it revealed about me. How had I allowed myself to become so predictable, so easily manipulated? Why had I been so desperate for appreciation that I'd ignored the warning signs of someone who was taking advantage of my generosity? How had I convinced myself that Mike's interest in my recipes was romantic when it was actually transactional? I thought about all the times over the past year when Mike had asked me to cook specific dishes, claiming he was craving them or wanted to practice techniques he'd learned at work. I'd been so pleased by his requests, interpreting them as evidence, that he valued my skills and wanted to learn from me. Now I understood that he'd been systematically documenting my family's recipes, learning not just the ingredients and procedures, but the stories and cultural context that would make them marketable to investors and customers. The weekend trips he'd taken for wine education suddenly made sense in a different light. He'd probably been scouting locations, meeting with potential business partners, developing the concept for a restaurant that would be built on my family's foundations without my knowledge or consent. The late nights he'd attributed to inventory and prep work had likely been spent planning a future that included Amanda but not me. A future where my contributions would be invisible and uncredited. I remembered the evening Mike had cooked dinner for my parents. How proud I'd been watching him prepare Abuela's mole sauce with careful attention to every detail she'd taught me. My mother had been impressed by his technique. My father had complimented the depth of flavor, and I'd felt like I was seeing my family's traditions honored by someone who truly understood their value. But Mike hadn't been honoring anything that night. He'd been performing, demonstrating his mastery of techniques he planned to profit from, showing my parents how well he'd learned the recipes he intended to steal. The pattern extended beyond just the cooking lessons. I thought about how Mike had gradually inserted himself into conversations about my family's history, asking questions about Abuela Rosa's background, about the stories behind specific recipes, about the cultural significance of various traditions. At the time, his curiosity had seemed like genuine interest in understanding my heritage better. Now I realized he'd been gathering marketing material, collecting the narrative elements that would make his restaurant concept more authentic and compelling to investors. Even my own family had been complicit in this theft without realizing it. During holiday gatherings, they'd shared stories about Abuela Rosa with Mike, delighted by his apparent interest in preserving family traditions. They'd shown him old photographs, described historical context for various recipes, explained the regional variations that made our family's versions unique. All of this information had been freely given, shared with someone they'd trusted to honor and protect our legacy. The most painful realization was how completely I'd participated in my own betrayal. I'd been so eager to share my inheritance with someone who seemed to value it that I'd never questioned Mike's motives or protected my family's secrets. I'd taught him every technique Abuela had taught me, explained every story she'd shared, demonstrated every ritual and tradition that made our recipes more than just lists of ingredients. I'd handed him the keys to my family's culinary legacy and never imagined he might use them to lock me out of my own inheritance. But as I sat in our apartment that evening, surrounded by the remnants of a marriage I'd thought was built on love and mutual respect, I felt something shifting inside me. The woman who'd spent her entire life being overlooked and underestimated, who'd accepted being taken for granted as the price of being needed, that woman was disappearing. In her place was someone harder, sharper, more dangerous than anyone who knew me could have imagined, because there was one thing Mike had never understood about me. One crucial detail he'd missed in all his careful calculations about my character. I hadn't inherited just Abuela Rosa's recipes. I'd inherited her strength, her fierce protectiveness. When it came to family, her ability to smile sweetly while planning devastating retribution for anyone who threatened what belonged to her. Abuela had been quiet and unassuming too, the kind of woman people underestimated until it was too late. She'd survived the depression by being resourceful and determined. She'd protected her family during difficult times by being strategic and patient. She'd built a legacy that lasted generations by understanding that sometimes the most powerful actions are the ones no one sees coming. Mike thought he knew me, thought he could predict my reactions and responses. He expected tears and confrontations, emotional scenes that he could manage with apologies and explanations and promises to do better. He was prepared for the kind of dramatic showdown that someone like Jessica would have provided, all fury and ultimatums and passionate declarations. He wasn't prepared for what he was actually going to get. He wasn't ready for the granddaughter of Rosa Martinez, who taught me that revenge is a dish best served with perfect timing and complete surprise. He had no idea that the quiet, supportive wife he'd been betraying was about to become the architect of his downfall. The recipes he'd stolen from me were about to become the weapon I used to destroy everything he'd tried to build. The morning that shattered the last of my illusions about my marriage started like any other Tuesday. I'd worked a night shift at the hospital, coming home exhausted but satisfied after helping a young mother through a difficult labor that had ended with a healthy baby and tears of relief. Mike had already left for his morning shift at Meridian, but he'd left me a note on the kitchen counter thanking me for covering the electric bill and mentioning that he'd be late coming home because of a special catering event the restaurant was handling. I should have been suspicious of how frequently these late nights had become part of his routine, but I'd attributed them to his dedication and ambition. The restaurant industry was demanding, and I knew that building a reputation required going above and beyond normal job requirements. I'd been proud of his work ethic, proud that he was willing to sacrifice immediate comfort for long-term career goals that would benefit both of us. After a few hours of sleep, I'd planned to spend the afternoon preparing for my cousin Elena's birthday dinner that weekend. She'd specifically requested my grandmother's tres leches cake, and I wanted to practice the recipe to make sure I achieved the perfect balance of sweetness and moisture that made Abuela's version legendary in our family. I'd picked up ingredients the day before: fresh eggs from the farmer's market, Mexican vanilla that I'd special ordered, the specific brand of condensed milk that Abuela had always insisted made a difference in the final texture. But as I was gathering my ingredients, I realized I'd forgotten to buy the evaporated milk that was crucial for the cake's signature 3-milk mixture. The corner store near our apartment carried it, but I knew their selection was limited and often expired. There was a Mexican grocery store about 15 minutes away that I preferred for specialty ingredients, and since I had time before my evening shift, I decided to make the trip for the freshest possible product. The drive to Mercado San Miguel gave me time to think about Elena's party and how much it meant to me that she'd requested Abuela's cake specifically. Elena was one of the few family members who'd spent significant time with our grandmother, learning not just recipes but the stories and traditions that gave them meaning. She understood that when I made that cake, I wasn't just preparing dessert. I was honoring our shared history and keeping Abuela's memory alive through the familiar ritual of mixing, baking, and serving something she'd perfected over decades. At the grocery store, I took my time selecting ingredients, enjoying the familiar sights and smells that reminded me of shopping trips with Abuela when I was young. She'd taught me to choose produce by feel and scent rather than appearance, to read labels carefully for additives that might alter traditional flavors, to buy spices in small quantities to ensure freshness. These lessons had served me well in my own cooking, helping me maintain the authenticity that made my family's recipes so special. I was walking back to my car with arms full of grocery bags when I heard a laugh that stopped me in my tracks. It was Mike's laugh, distinctive and warm, the sound that had once made my heart skip, but now made my stomach clench with recognition. I looked around the parking lot until I spotted him near the back corner, standing next to a car I didn't recognize, and talking animatedly with a woman I'd never seen before. They were standing close together, closer than casual conversation would require, and there was an intimacy in their body language that made my mouth go dry. The woman was petite and elegant, with long black hair and an easy smile that suggested she was completely comfortable with Mike in a way that spoke of significant time spent together. She was holding what appeared to be a folder or portfolio, and as I watched, Mike opened it and began examining papers inside with obvious interest and excitement. I should have approached them, should have called out to Mike and asked what he was doing there, who this woman was, why he'd told me he was working a catering event when he was clearly free to meet friends for what appeared to be an extended conversation. But something about the scene felt too intimate, too purposeful, for casual explanation. Instead, I found myself moving closer, using parked cars as cover while I tried to understand what I was witnessing. The woman was showing Mike photographs, pointing to specific details and talking enthusiastically about something that was making him nod and smile with genuine excitement. I caught fragments of their conversation as the wind carried their voices in my direction. Words about authentic and traditional and family recipes that made my blood run cold. When Mike pulled out his phone and started taking pictures of whatever she was showing him, I knew with horrible certainty that this meeting had nothing to do with his job at Meridian, and everything to do with plans he'd been keeping secret from me. I moved closer, positioning myself behind a large pickup truck where I could see and hear more clearly without being detected. The woman was Amanda Chen, though I didn't know her name yet, and she was showing Mike what appeared to be a business plan or presentation folder filled with photographs, documents, and what looked like menu layouts. As they talked, pieces of a conversation I wasn't supposed to overhear began fitting together into a picture that made me feel physically sick. The investors loved the sample menu, Amanda was saying, her voice bright with excitement. Especially the mole sauce recipe. They said the complexity of flavors was exactly what they were looking for in an authentic Mexican restaurant. One of them actually asked if we could guarantee exclusivity for certain dishes, make sure no other restaurants in Austin would have access to the same recipes. Mike's response made my knees weak. Don't worry about that. These recipes have never been published or shared outside the family. Sarah's grandmother took most of the secrets to her grave, and Sarah only learned them because she was the chosen one, the granddaughter who showed the most interest in preserving traditions. As far as I know, she's never taught them to anyone except me. The casual way he said my name, the matter-of-fact tone he used when describing my relationship with Abuela Rosa, the complete absence of guilt or hesitation in his voice as he discussed stealing my inheritance, it all hit me like a physical blow. This wasn't a moment of weakness or a recent decision born from marital problems. This was a calculated, long-term plan that he'd been executing with cold precision for months, maybe years. Amanda nodded enthusiastically, flipping through more pages in her folder. The timing couldn't be better. Mexican cuisine is having such a moment right now, but most restaurants are doing fusion or modern interpretations. Having authentic, traditional recipes that tell a real story, that's our competitive advantage, especially with your technical skills to execute them at restaurant quality. That's what I love about working with you, Mike replied, and the warmth in his voice when he spoke to her was something I hadn't heard directed at me in months. You understand the business side in ways that Sarah never could. She sees these recipes as family heirlooms to be protected and preserved exactly as they were. You see them as the foundation for something bigger, something that can actually honor the tradition by sharing it with more people. The rationalization in his words was breathtaking. He was reframing theft as preservation, betrayal as honor, the commercialization of my family's legacy as some kind of cultural service. He'd convinced himself, or was trying to convince Amanda, that stealing my recipes was actually a noble act that would somehow benefit the traditions he was violating. Amanda pulled out what looked like architectural drawings, spreading them across the hood of her car. I drove by the location again yesterday, and I'm even more convinced it's perfect. The space has such character, and the neighborhood is exactly the demographic we want to attract. Young professionals, food enthusiasts, people who appreciate authenticity but have disposable income for regular dining out. Mike leaned over the drawings, pointing to specific areas and asking questions about seating capacity, kitchen layout, and service flow. They discussed these plans with the familiarity of people who'd spent considerable time developing them together, people who'd shared long conversations about their shared vision and mutual goals. As I listened to them plan their future, I realized that this restaurant wasn't just a business venture for them. It was a relationship, a partnership that went far beyond professional collaboration. "What about Sarah?" Amanda asked suddenly, and my heart stopped. "When are you planning to tell her about our partnership? About the restaurant?" Mike was quiet for a long moment, and when he finally spoke, his voice carried a weight that suggested this wasn't the first time they'd discussed this particular problem. "Sarah's complicated. She's incredibly supportive of my career goals, but she's also very protective of her family's recipes. She sees them as sacred, untouchable. If I tell her about the restaurant too early, before we have investors locked in, and leases signed, she might try to stop us." "Stop us how?" Amanda's voice carried a note of concern that suggested she'd been worrying about this potential obstacle. "She could claim intellectual property theft," Mike said matter-of-factly. The recipes might be traditional, but the specific variations her family developed, the stories and cultural context that make them marketable, those could arguably belong to her. If she wanted to make trouble, she could probably tie us up in legal battles that would scare off investors and delay our opening indefinitely. The fact that he'd considered this possibility, that he'd researched the legal implications of what he was doing, and decided to proceed anyway, revealed a level of premeditation that took my breath away. This wasn't impulse or passion, or even simple greed. This was calculated theft, executed with full knowledge of the harm it would cause me and complete disregard for my rights or feelings. Amanda frowned, clearly disturbed by this information. "That sounds risky. Maybe we should consider developing our own recipes instead, or finding other sources for traditional dishes. I don't want to build our business on something that could be taken away from us." Mike shook his head firmly. "You haven't tasted these recipes the way I have. You haven't seen how people react when they experience authentic flavors that connect them to something real and historical. These aren't just good recipes, Amanda. They're magical. They're the kind of food that creates loyal customers and generates word-of-mouth marketing that money can't buy. We can't replicate that kind of authenticity artificially. But what if Sarah finds out before we're ready? What if she discovers our plans and tries to interfere?" Mike's answer made my blood turn to ice. Sarah won't find out because Sarah doesn't pay attention to anything outside her work at the hospital. She's so focused on her patients and her shifts that she barely notices what's happening in her own life. As long as I keep covering my tracks and maintain the appearance of a devoted husband, she'll never suspect anything until it's too late to stop us. The dismissive certainty in his voice, the casual cruelty of reducing me to someone so oblivious and self-absorbed that I couldn't recognize betrayal happening under my own roof, was more devastating than discovering the affair or the theft. This was how Mike really saw me, not as a partner or even an obstacle, but as someone so fundamentally irrelevant that I could be deceived indefinitely without consequence. Amanda seemed somewhat reassured by his confidence, but she still looked troubled. "I still think we should have a backup plan. What if she's not as oblivious as you think? What if she starts asking questions or gets suspicious about your schedule?" "And we'll deal with that if it happens," Mike said with a shrug. "But honestly, Sarah is the most trusting person I've ever met. She's never questioned a single explanation I've given her, never checked up on me, never even looked at my phone or computer. She believes everything I tell her because she assumes everyone operates with the same level of honesty she does. It's actually kind of naive, but it works in our favor. The word naive hit me like a slap. All those years I'd thought my trust was a gift I was giving Mike, a demonstration of my love and confidence in our relationship. He'd seen it as stupidity, a character flaw he could exploit for his own benefit. The woman he'd married, the woman who'd supported his dreams and shared her most precious inheritance with him, was someone he saw as foolishly trusting rather than genuinely loving. They spent another 20 minutes discussing logistics, timelines, and financial projections. Mike showed Amanda photos on his phone of dishes I'd made recently, explaining techniques and ingredients with the authority of someone who'd never credited his source of knowledge. He described my grandmother's approach to seasoning, her philosophy about cooking with love and intention, her belief that food could carry emotional and spiritual energy from the cook to those being served. All of this sacred knowledge shared with someone who saw it only as marketing copy for a business plan. When they finally began packing up their materials, preparing to leave, Amanda asked one more question that made my stomach drop. Are you sure you can continue learning new recipes without making Sarah suspicious? We've got most of the main dishes covered, but it would be great to have a few more dessert options. Maybe some breakfast items we could serve during weekend brunch. Mike grinned with the confidence of someone who'd been successfully deceiving his wife for months. Leave that to me. Sarah loves teaching me about her family's traditions. All I have to do is express interest in learning something new, maybe mention that I'm trying to improve my dessert skills for work, and she'll spend hours showing me every technique her grandmother taught her. She thinks she's preserving family traditions by sharing them with me. She has no idea she's actually handing them over to be commercialized. They embraced before getting into their separate cars, and the hug lasted longer than mere business partners would require. Amanda's hand lingered on Mike's arm as they said goodbye, and the look that passed between them carried an intimacy that made their relationship crystal clear. This wasn't just professional collaboration or even simple infidelity. This was love, or at least what they thought was love, built on shared dreams and mutual betrayal of the woman who'd made their plans possible. I waited in the parking lot until both their cars disappeared before walking to my own vehicle on shaking legs. The grocery bags I'd been carrying felt impossibly heavy, filled with ingredients for a cake I'd planned to make in honor of my grandmother's memory, using techniques I'd learned from a woman who'd trusted me to protect and preserve what she'd spent a lifetime perfecting. The drive home passed in a blur of rage and heartbreak, and something else I couldn't quite name yet. By the time I pulled into our apartment complex, that unnamed feeling had crystallized into something cold and sharp and absolutely certain. It wasn't just anger, though anger was certainly part of it. It wasn't just betrayal, though the betrayal was deeper than anything I'd ever experienced. It was recognition, the sudden clarity that comes when you finally see a situation exactly as it is, rather than as you'd hoped it might be. Mike hadn't just stolen my recipes or cheated on our marriage. He'd stolen my identity, my history, my connection to the woman who'd raised me to be proud of my heritage and protective of my family's legacy. He'd taken the love and trust I'd offered him and weaponized them against me, using my own generosity to fund his betrayal and my own naivety to hide his deception. But in his arrogance and contempt, Mike had made one crucial error in judgment. He'd confused my kindness with weakness, my trust with stupidity, my quiet strength with passive acceptance. He'd assumed that because I'd never challenged him or questioned his explanations, I was incapable of recognizing betrayal or responding to it effectively. The woman who'd fallen in love with Mike Patterson, who'd shared her grandmother's recipes with him because she'd believed he would honor and protect them, that woman had died in the parking lot of Mercado San Miguel. The woman driving home to their shared apartment was someone entirely different, someone who understood exactly what needed to be done and had the patience and intelligence to do it properly. That evening, when Mike came home from what he claimed was his catering event, I greeted him with the same warm smile I'd always given him. I asked about his day, listened to his fabricated stories about demanding customers and kitchen disasters, expressed sympathy for the stress he claimed to be experiencing at work. I played the role of the trusting, supportive wife with such perfect authenticity that he never suspected anything had changed. But everything had changed. While Mike thought he was coming home to the same naive woman he'd been deceiving for months, he was actually walking into the carefully controlled environment of someone who now knew exactly who he was and what he was capable of. Someone who was already 3 steps ahead of him, already planning a response that would be proportional to the betrayal he'd committed. As we sat together at dinner that night, sharing the meal I'd prepared using techniques my grandmother had taught me, I watched Mike eat my food and lie to my face with the same casual ease he'd displayed in the parking lot earlier. He complimented the flavors, asked questions about preparation methods, and made appreciative sounds that I now recognized as the performance of someone documenting rather than enjoying what I'd created. Every bite he took, every false compliment he offered, every technique he observed and mentally cataloged for future use with Amanda, all of it was fuel for the fire that was building inside me. Mike thought he was eating dinner with his unsuspecting wife. He was actually sharing what would be one of his last meals prepared with my grandmother's recipes, though he had no way of knowing that yet. The woman sitting across from him, smiling and nodding and asking about his day, she was already planning his downfall with the same careful attention to detail that Abuela Rosa had used when perfecting her most complex dishes. Every ingredient, measured precisely, every step executed at exactly the right moment, every element combined to create something that would be memorable for all the right reasons. Mike had stolen my recipes to build his future with Amanda. I was going to use those same recipes to destroy everything he thought he was creating, and I was going to do it in a way that would ensure he never forgot the cost of betraying someone who'd loved him enough to share her most precious inheritance. The game was about to begin, and Mike had no idea he was already losing. The woman who woke up the morning after discovering Mike's betrayal was fundamentally different from the one who had fallen asleep beside him. I lay in our bed for nearly an hour before sunrise, listening to his peaceful breathing and watching the shadows move across the ceiling as early morning traffic filtered light through our bedroom windows. Mike slept deeply, without the restlessness or guilt-induced insomnia I might have expected from someone living such an elaborate lie. His ability to compartmentalize his deception was almost impressive in its thoroughness. I studied his face in the dim light, this man I'd shared a bed with for 8 years, and tried to reconcile the features I knew so well with the stranger I'd discovered him to be. The mouth that had kissed me goodbye every morning had also been sharing my family's secrets with another woman. The hands that had held mine during difficult times had been photographing my cooking techniques for profit. The brain behind those closed eyes had been calculating how to steal my inheritance while maintaining the facade of a loving husband. For the first time in our marriage, I felt completely alone, even while lying next to him. The isolation wasn't lonely, though. It was clarifying. Without the constant need to consider Mike's feelings, opinions, or reactions, I could think with a precision and focus I'd never experienced before. Every decision I made going forward would be mine alone, guided by my own moral compass rather than the desire to preserve a relationship that had been built on lies from the beginning. I slipped out of bed quietly and made my way to the kitchen, where I started the coffee using Abuela's special blend that Mike had always claimed to love. As I waited for it to brew, I found myself thinking about all the mornings I'd prepared this same coffee as an act of love, believing I was sharing something sacred with someone who would treasure it. Now I understood that every cup I'd made, him had been research, another data point in his systematic theft of my heritage. The realization should have made me cry, but it didn't. Instead, it filled me with a calm determination that surprised me with its intensity. I wasn't the victim. In this story anymore, I was the protagonist, the one with the power to determine how this situation would resolve. Mike thought he was writing our story, but he'd made the mistake of underestimating the other main character. I poured my coffee and sat at our small kitchen table, the same place where Mike and I had shared thousands of meals and conversations over the years. The normalcy of the setting felt surreal given the magnitude of what had changed in my understanding of our relationship. Everything looked the same, but nothing was the same. The coffee tasted different when you knew it was being evaluated rather than enjoyed. The morning light seemed harsher when it illuminated a space that had been contaminated by deception. As I sipped my coffee, I began to plan. Not emotionally, not reactively, but with the methodical approach I used when developing care plans for complex medical cases at the hospital. First, I needed to gather more information about the scope of Mike's betrayal. How long had he been planning this restaurant with Amanda? How many of my recipes had he already shared? What was their timeline for opening? Who were their investors? And how much did they know about the true source of the recipes they were funding? Second, I needed to document everything I could about my family's culinary traditions. If Mike was planning to steal my inheritance, I needed to establish clear ownership and provenance for every recipe, every technique, every story that Abuela Rosa had passed down to me. I had photographs, handwritten recipe cards, even some old video recordings of family gatherings where she demonstrated her cooking methods. All of this evidence would be crucial if I decided to pursue legal action. Third, I needed to understand exactly what Mike and Amanda were building together. Were they just business partners, or was their relationship romantic as well? How much money had they invested in their plans? What commitments had they made to investors or landlords that would be difficult or expensive to break? The more entangled their lives became, the more devastating it would be when their carefully constructed house of cards collapsed. Finally, I needed to decide what kind of justice I wanted to pursue. Part of me was tempted to confront Mike immediately, to demand explanations and apologies and promises to abandon his plans with Amanda. But that approach would only give him the opportunity to cover his tracks more carefully, to develop better lies, to perhaps accelerate his timeline in ways that would make it harder for me to protect my family's legacy. No, confrontation wasn't the answer. Mike had spent months planning his betrayal in secret, using my trust and love against me while building a future that excluded me entirely. He deserved to experience the same sense of powerlessness and betrayal that he'd inflicted on me, but amplified by the public humiliation of having his theft exposed when it would cause maximum damage to his carefully laid plans. I finished my coffee as Mike's alarm began ringing in our bedroom. Within minutes, he appeared in the kitchen, hair tousled and eyes still heavy with sleep, looking for all the world like the devoted husband I'd once believed him to be. He kissed my forehead and commented on how good the coffee smelled, asking if I'd made extra for him to take to work. The casual intimacy of the gesture made my skin crawl, but I smiled and poured him a travel mug, adding the cream and sugar in proportions I'd memorized years ago. "You're up early," he commented, settling at the table with his coffee and checking his phone for messages. "Everything okay?" I nodded, explaining that I'd woken up thinking about Elena's birthday party and wanted to get an early start on cake. Preparation. Mike's face lit up with what appeared to be genuine pleasure, and he asked if I needed any help with ingredients or preparation. The offer would have been sweet if I hadn't known that his real motivation was gathering more information about Abuela's techniques. "Actually," I said, as if the thought had just occurred to me, "I was thinking about making a few different desserts for the party." Elena mentioned that her new boyfriend is interested in traditional Mexican cooking, and I thought it might be nice to showcase some of Abuela's specialties. Mike leaned forward with obvious interest, his phone forgotten as he focused entirely on what I was saying. "That sounds amazing. Which recipes were you thinking about?" I mentioned several desserts that I'd never made for Mike before. Family recipes that Abuela had reserved for special occasions, or that required techniques I'd been saving for when I felt he was ready to learn them. Mike's enthusiasm for helping me prepare these new dishes was so transparent that I had to bite my tongue to keep from laughing. He was practically salivating at the prospect of adding more authentic recipes to his stolen collection. We spent the next 20 minutes discussing preparation schedules and ingredient lists, with Mike offering to help with shopping and prep work in ways that would give him maximum exposure to techniques he hadn't learned yet. I agreed to everything he suggested, playing the role of grateful wife while internally cataloging every recipe he showed interest in, every technique he wanted to observe, every story he asked me to share about the cultural significance of various dishes. After Mike left for work, I sat alone in our kitchen and felt the last vestiges of my old self disappear. The woman who had trusted completely, who had shared her most precious inheritance without reservation, who had believed that love meant giving everything and asking for nothing in return, she was gone. In her place was someone harder, smarter, more strategic than anyone who knew me could have imagined. This new version of myself understood that some betrayals were too profound for forgiveness, too calculated for reconciliation. Mike hadn't made a mistake or succumbed to temptation. He had made a choice, a series of deliberate choices to steal from me while lying to my face and planning a future that erased me from my own heritage. That kind of premeditated cruelty deserved consequences that were equally calculated and devastating. I spent the morning calling in sick to work, claiming a stomach bug that would keep me home for the next few days. Then I began the methodical process of documenting my case against Mike. I photographed every handwritten recipe card that Abuela had left me, scanning them into digital files and uploading them to secure cloud storage. I gathered family photos that showed her cooking, videos from holiday gatherings where she demonstrated techniques, even old church bulletins that mentioned her contributions to fundraising dinners. More importantly, I began researching intellectual property law, specifically as it related to traditional recipes and cultural heritage. I learned about cases where families had successfully claimed ownership of traditional dishes, about the legal protections available for culinary techniques that had been passed down through generations, about the ways that cultural appropriation could be challenged in court. By lunchtime, I had compiled a comprehensive file that established my family's ownership of the recipes Mike was planning to steal. I had proof of their historical significance, documentation of how they'd been passed down through generations, evidence of their cultural importance to our community. If Mike wanted to claim that these recipes were public domain, or that he'd learned them independently, he would find himself facing a legal battle he couldn't win. But legal action was only one option, and possibly not the most satisfying one. Court cases took time and money, and there was always the possibility that Mike could settle quietly or find ways to minimize the damage to his reputation and future prospects. I wanted something more immediate, more public, more devastating than a lawsuit that might take years to resolve. I wanted Mike to experience the same sense of betrayal and powerlessness that he'd inflicted on me, but amplified by the humiliation of having his theft exposed in front of everyone who mattered to his future success. I wanted Amanda to understand that building a business on stolen foundations would leave her with nothing when the truth came out. I wanted their investors to know exactly what kind of people they were funding, and I wanted the Austin food community to understand that supporting their restaurant meant participating in cultural theft. Most of all, I wanted to reclaim my family's legacy in a way that would honor Abuela Rosa's memory while ensuring that her recipes remained where they belonged, with the people who had earned the right to preserve and share them through generations of love and sacrifice. The plan that began forming in my mind that afternoon was elegant in its simplicity and devastating in its potential impact. Instead of trying to stop Mike from stealing my recipes, I would let him proceed with his plans, while building a case that would destroy everything he thought he was creating. Instead of confronting him privately, I would expose his theft publicly, at the moment when it would cause maximum damage to his professional reputation and personal relationships. Mike thought he was stealing from someone who was too naive and trusting to fight back. He was about to discover that the quiet strength he'd mistaken for weakness was actually the most dangerous force he'd ever encountered. The granddaughter of Rosa Martinez had inherited more than just recipes from her grandmother. She'd inherited the fierce protectiveness and strategic thinking that had helped a woman survive the Depression and raise a family through decades of economic and social challenges. Mike had awakened something in me that he never should have disturbed. Now he was going to learn why my grandmother's enemies had always learned to fear her smile more than her anger. The next morning, I began my investigation with the methodical approach of someone who understood that evidence gathering required patience and precision. While Mike slept peacefully beside me, apparently unburdened by guilt or anxiety about his deception, I was already planning how to systematically uncover the full scope of his betrayal. The woman he'd married would have confronted him immediately, demanded explanations, and probably accepted whatever lies he offered. The woman I'd become understood that real power came from knowing everything before revealing anything. I started with his digital footprint, the electronic trail that most people leave without considering how much it reveals about their true activities and intentions. Mike had always been casual about password security, using the same simple combination for multiple accounts, never imagining that his trusting wife might one day need to access information he was hiding from her. His laptop, which he left open and unattended during his morning shower routine, became my first source of intelligence. His email account revealed months of correspondence with Amanda Chen that painted a detailed picture of their relationship and business plans. The earliest messages, dating back almost a year, were purely professional in tone, focused on market research and concept development for what they initially called Authentic Austin Eatery. But as I scrolled through their communications chronologically, I watched their partnership evolve from business collaboration to personal intimacy with a clarity that made my stomach turn. The transition had been gradual but unmistakable. Professional discussions about target demographics and profit margins had slowly been interspersed with personal observations about shared interests and similar goals. Amanda had begun including casual comments about Mike's insights and creativity, while he'd responded with increasingly warm praise for her business acumen and vision. By spring, their emails included inside jokes and references to private conversations that clearly indicated they were spending significant time together outside of their official planning sessions. More damaging than the evidence of their personal relationship was the detailed documentation of how Mike had been systematically stealing my family's recipes for their business plan. He'd sent Amanda photographs of dishes I'd prepared, complete, with detailed descriptions of ingredients and techniques that I'd taught him in private moments I'd believed were acts of love and trust. He'd transcribed conversations about Abuela Rosa's cooking philosophy, turning intimate family stories into marketing copy for their restaurant concept. One email thread from June made me so angry I had to close the laptop and walk away from it for several minutes. Mike had sent Amanda a detailed recipe for my grandmother's mole sauce, including not just the ingredients and proportions, but the spiritual and cultural context that made it special. He'd described Abuela's belief that the sauce should be prepared over 2 days to allow the flavors to develop properly, that certain spices should be toasted individually to maximize their impact, that the final result should taste like generations of love stirred together. Amanda's response had been enthusiastic, but also disturbingly calculating. She'd written about how the authentic family heritage angle would differentiate their restaurant from competitors, how the generational wisdom aspect would appeal to customers seeking genuine cultural experiences, how they could use the passed down through generations narrative in their marketing materials to justify premium pricing. They weren't just stealing my recipes, they were commercializing my family's history, turning sacred traditions into marketing strategies designed to extract maximum profit from customers who trusted they were getting authentic cultural experiences. The casual way they discussed monetizing my grandmother's legacy, as if her lifetime of culinary mastery was just another business asset to be leveraged, made me understand that this betrayal went far deeper than simple infidelity or even recipe theft. As I continued reading through their correspondence, I discovered that Mike and Amanda had been lying not just to me, but to their potential investors as well. In communications with funding sources, they'd presented themselves as a couple with deep personal connections to traditional Mexican cuisine, claiming that their recipes had been collected through extensive family research and cultural immersion. They'd created elaborate backstories about their own heritage and cooking backgrounds, fabricating personal connections to the traditions they were actually stealing from me. Their business plan, which I found saved in multiple versions on Mike's laptop, was a masterpiece of cultural appropriation disguised as authentic preservation. They'd positioned their restaurant as a tribute to disappearing culinary traditions, claiming they were preserving important cultural knowledge that might otherwise be lost. The irony was breathtaking. They were justifying theft as preservation, presenting themselves as cultural guardians while actually engaging in the exact kind of exploitation that threatened authentic traditions. The financial projections in their business plan were ambitious and detailed, indicating they'd invested significant time and probably money in developing their concept. They'd secured preliminary commitments from 3 different investor groups, identified a specific location in East Austin that they wanted to lease, and developed a timeline that would have them opening within 6 months. The more entrenched their plans became, the more devastating it would be when everything collapsed. Mike's phone provided another layer of evidence about the scope of his deception. His text message history with Amanda revealed a level of intimacy and emotional connection that went far beyond business partnership. They exchanged good morning and good night messages, shared photos from their daily lives, and discussed future plans that clearly assumed they'd be building a life together. More disturbing were the messages where they discussed me, analyzing my schedule and behavior patterns to identify opportunities for their secret meetings. In one particularly revealing exchange from early September, Amanda had asked Mike about the best times to schedule their planning sessions without arousing my suspicion. Mike had responded with a detailed analysis of my work schedule, explaining which days I worked double shifts and would be too exhausted to pay attention to his activities, which weekends I typically spent with family and wouldn't be available to monitor his whereabouts. He'd also shared strategies for maintaining my trust while continuing to extract information about my family's recipes. He'd told Amanda that the key was showing just enough interest in my cooking to learn new techniques without seeming suspicious, expressing enthusiasm for family traditions while gradually steering conversations toward the technical details he needed for restaurant preparation. Reading his calculated approach to manipulating my emotions and exploiting my trust felt like discovering that someone had been performing surgery on my heart while I slept. Most chilling was a text thread where they'd discussed what would happen to me after their restaurant opened. Amanda had worried that I might eventually discover the source of their recipes and cause problems for their business. Mike had reassured her that by the time I figured out what they'd done, they'd be established enough to weather any accusations I might make. He'd suggested that most people would assume I was a disgruntled ex-wife trying to cause trouble rather than someone with legitimate ownership claims to their recipes. The casual cruelty of planning for my humiliation and dismissal, the way they'd reduced my potential pain to a minor business consideration that could be managed with proper timing, and public relations strategy revealed a level of moral bankruptcy that took my breath away. They weren't just stealing from me. They were anticipating and planning for the moment when I'd discover their theft, calculating how to minimize the impact of my inevitable devastation. I spent 3 days combing through every piece of digital evidence I could access, building a comprehensive picture of Mike and Amanda's relationship, business plans, and systematic theft of my inheritance. I screenshot conversations, saved business documents, and created detailed timelines that showed exactly how their deception had evolved and escalated over time. By the end of my investigation, I had enough evidence to destroy their restaurant plans, their investor relationships, and their personal reputations simultaneously. But evidence was only the foundation for justice. not justice itself. As I compiled my findings into organized files, I began planning exactly how and when to deploy the information I'd gathered. The key was timing. I needed to wait until Mike and Amanda were most vulnerable, most invested in their plans, most convinced that their success was guaranteed. The deeper they dug themselves into their deception, the more devastating it would be when the truth came out. Mike returned home each evening during my investigation period, completely unaware that his digital life had been thoroughly examined and documented. He'd ask about my day, share fabricated stories about his work at the restaurant, and continue the charade of being a devoted husband while secretly planning his exit from our marriage. His ability to maintain this performance while knowing what he was really doing was almost impressive in its sociopathic completeness. On Thursday evening, Mike suggested that we cook together over the weekend, claiming he wanted to learn more about Abuela's bread recipes for a special project at work. His eagerness to extract even more knowledge from me, even after I'd discovered his betrayal, demonstrated exactly how little he understood about the person he'd been deceiving. He thought he was manipulating someone who would never fight back. He was actually providing more evidence for someone who was already planning his complete destruction. I agreed to teach him the bread recipes with enthusiasm that matched his own, playing the role of loving wife while internally calculating how each technique he learned from me would become another count in the indictment I was building against him. Every moment he spent stealing from me was another nail in the coffin of the future he thought he was building with Amanda. The investigation phase had given me more than just evidence of Mike's betrayal. It had given me a clear understanding of exactly how much damage I could inflict when I chose to reveal what I knew. Their restaurant plans, their investor relationships, their personal reputations, their romantic partnership, all of it was built on foundations that would crumble. The moment their theft was exposed publicly, Mike thought he was stealing my recipes to build his dream life with Amanda. Instead, he was providing me with everything I needed to turn that dream into his worst nightmare. The opportunity for perfect justice arrived in the most ironic way possible, delivered directly to my inbox by the very people who had been betraying me. On a rainy Tuesday morning in late October, while Mike was at his job at Meridian and presumably planning his next move with Amanda, I received an email that made me smile for the first time since discovering their deception. The message came from Jennifer Walsh, the food and culture editor at Austin Monthly magazine, a prestigious local publication that covered dining, arts, and lifestyle topics for the city's most influential residents. Jennifer explained that she'd been following my Instagram account, where I'd been posting photos of family meals and traditional recipes for the past few years, initially just to share with relatives who lived in other states but had gained a small following among Austin food enthusiasts. Jennifer's email was professionally written but warm in tone, expressing genuine admiration for what she called the authentic cultural storytelling evident in my posts. She mentioned specific dishes that had caught her attention, particularly a recent photo I'd shared of Abuela Rosa's tres leches cake with a caption explaining how the recipe had been passed down through 4 generations of women in my family. She'd been impressed by the historical context I provided with each dish, the way I connected food to family stories and cultural traditions. The magazine, Jennifer explained, was planning a special December issue focused on preserving Austin's culinary heritage, featuring families and individuals who were keeping traditional food cultures alive in an increasingly commercialized dining landscape. She wanted to feature my family's story as the centerpiece of the issue, with a comprehensive article about Abuela Rosa's legacy and the recipes she'd passed down to me. The proposal was extensive and flattering. Jennifer wanted to conduct in-depth interviews about my grandmother's background, the historical and cultural significance of her recipes, and my own role in preserving these traditions for future generations. She proposed a professional photo shoot featuring me preparing several of Abuela's signature dishes, with step-by-step documentation of techniques and ingredients. Most significantly, she wanted to include complete recipes in the magazine, properly credited and contextualized within their cultural and family history. As I read Jennifer's proposal, I felt pieces clicking into place like ingredients combining to create something greater than the sum of their parts. This wasn't just an opportunity for recognition or cultural preservation, though both of those aspects were meaningful to me. This was the perfect weapon, delivered at exactly the right moment to reclaim my inheritance while simultaneously destroying Mike and Amanda's plans to profit from it. The timing couldn't have been better. According to the email thread I'd discovered, on Mike's laptop, he and Amanda were planning to finalize their investor agreements in early December and sign their restaurant lease before the end of the year. They wanted to begin construction immediately after New Year's Day, with a projected opening date in late spring. Jennifer's article would be published in the December issue of Austin Monthly, which would hit newsstands and subscribers' mailboxes. Just as Mike and Amanda were cementing their business relationships and making their final financial commitments. More importantly, Austin Monthly's readership included exactly the demographic that Mike and Amanda were targeting for their restaurant: affluent, educated food enthusiasts who valued authenticity and cultural significance in their dining experiences. These were people who would read Jennifer's article about my family's culinary heritage and then recognize those same recipes when Mike and Amanda's restaurant opened, claiming them as their own family traditions. I spent the rest of the morning crafting my response to Jennifer, accepting her proposal with enthusiasm, while carefully positioning the story in ways that would maximize the damage to Mike's plans. I emphasized the sacred nature of these recipes within my family, explaining how they'd never been shared outside our blood relatives until I'd trusted them with my husband as part of our marriage bond. I described the spiritual and emotional significance of each dish, the stories and memories that made them more than just lists of ingredients and instructions. Most importantly, I positioned myself clearly as the sole surviving keeper of these traditions, the only person alive who possessed the complete knowledge that Abuela Rosa had spent her lifetime perfecting. I explained how she'd chosen me specifically to carry on her legacy, how she'd taught me not just the mechanical aspects of cooking, but the cultural and emotional context that made each dish a connection to our family's history. Jennifer responded within hours, clearly excited by the depth and authenticity of the story I was offering. She suggested we begin with a preliminary interview the following week, which would allow her to understand the scope of the article and plan the photography sessions accordingly. She mentioned that the magazine's photographer was particularly skilled at capturing the emotional resonance of traditional cooking, and that they'd want to document both the technical aspects of recipe preparation and the cultural storytelling that made my family's traditions special. As we exchanged emails over the next few days, fine-tuning the details of our collaboration, I began to understand exactly how devastating this article would be to Mike's plans. Jennifer wasn't just interested in publishing recipes. She wanted to create a comprehensive portrait of cultural preservation, complete with historical context, family stories, and my personal journey as the guardian of these traditions. The article would establish my ownership of these recipes so thoroughly and publicly that any attempt to commercialize them without my permission would be immediately recognizable as theft. The photography sessions alone would provide irrefutable evidence of my expertise and connection to these dishes. Unlike Mike, who'd learned techniques by watching me cook, I could demonstrate the intuitive understanding that came from growing up with these recipes, the muscle memory and instinctive adjustments that distinguished authentic preparation from mere imitation. The photos would show me in my element, surrounded by the tools and ingredients that connected me to my grandmother's legacy, preparing dishes with the confidence and skill of someone who'd been born to this tradition. On Friday evening, I mentioned Jennifer's proposal to Mike over dinner, watching his reaction carefully as I described the magazine's interest in featuring our family's recipes. His initial response was enthusiastic, congratulating me on the recognition and expressing pride in my family's culinary heritage. But as I explained the scope of the article, the comprehensive nature of the recipe documentation, and the magazine's intention to establish clear provenance for each dish, I saw something shift in his expression. Mike began asking questions that revealed his growing concern about the timing and scope of the article. He wondered if it might be better to wait until after the holidays, when the magazine might have more space for a thorough treatment of the why story. He suggested that sharing complete recipes in print might diminish their special nature, making them too accessible to people who wouldn't properly appreciate their cultural significance. He even proposed that we might want to consult with other family members before making such detailed information public. His transparent attempt to delay or derail the article confirmed that he understood exactly how much damage it would cause to his plans with Amanda. If Austin Monthly published a comprehensive feature establishing my ownership of these recipes in December, their restaurant opening in spring would be immediately recognizable as cultural appropriation and theft. Their investors would realize they'd been deceived about the authenticity of the concept. Their potential customers would know they were participating in exploitation rather than cultural appreciation. I reassured Mike that I'd considered all of his concerns carefully, but that I felt strongly about the importance of preserving these traditions in a permanent public format. I explained that Abuela Rosa had always worried about her recipes being lost or forgotten after her death, and that this article would ensure her legacy lived on even after I was gone. I positioned the magazine feature as a tribute to my grandmother's memory, making any opposition from Mike seem callous and unsupportive. Over the weekend, I watched Mike struggle with the implications of the article while trying to maintain his facade of spousal support. He made several attempts to dissuade me from participating, each more transparent than the last. He worried about privacy, about family traditions becoming too commercial, about the magazine potentially misrepresenting our cultural heritage. All of his concerns were really about the article's potential impact on his secret plans, but he couldn't voice those objections without revealing what he'd been hiding from me. By Sunday evening, Mike seemed to have accepted that the article was going forward, regardless of his concerns. His resignation was almost comical. This man who'd been so confident in his ability to control and manipulate me, suddenly faced with a situation where his opinion was irrelevant and his concerns were dismissed. He'd spent months planning to steal my inheritance while assuming I'd remain passive and oblivious. Now he was watching helplessly as I took actions that would make his theft impossible while maintaining the appearance of innocent cultural preservation. The preliminary interview with Jennifer was scheduled for the following Tuesday, which would give me the weekend to prepare materials and organize my thoughts about how to present my family's story most effectively. I spent Saturday gathering photographs, recipe cards, and family documents that would support the article's historical context. I practiced talking about Abuela Rosa's background and cooking philosophy, refining the stories I wanted to share about her impact on my life and her role in preserving our cultural traditions. Most importantly, I began planning exactly which recipes to feature in the article, choosing dishes that Mike had already shared with Amanda, while ensuring that every technique and cultural context was thoroughly documented under my name. By the time their restaurant opened, any food enthusiast in Austin would be able to recognize the stolen recipes immediately, understanding exactly whose heritage was being commercialized without permission. The perfect opportunity hadn't just presented itself. It had arrived gift-wrapped with a bow, delivered directly to my inbox at exactly the moment when it would cause maximum damage to the people who'd betrayed me. Mike thought he was stealing from someone too naive to protect herself. Instead, he'd awakened someone who understood that the best revenge wasn't confrontation or emotional scenes, but the systematic destruction of everything he'd tried to build on the foundation of his theft. The game was entering its final phase, and Mike still had no idea that he'd already lost. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.